And in steadfast love, a throne will be established, and he will sit upon it in truth, in the tent of David, judge and seeker of justice and swift righteousness. Hello, everybody. This is Gilgamesh, and today we are going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 16. This is a continuation of the burden or the Massah against Moab. We covered this in the last chapter on my previous video, and now we're going to see where this leads next. As I was preparing for this episode here, there is a great dissertation by Julie Irene Woods, published in 2009 from Durham University. I will link to it in the comments. But she did an excellent job of comparing the similarities between Jeremiah 48 and Isaiah 15 and 16. And I mentioned some of those similarities in the last video, but she summarizes it very nicely here, pointing out some interesting facts. Jeremiah 48 and Isaiah 15 through 16 not only share a considerable amount of material, on the other hand, but they are similar in other ways too. First, they both refer to a large number of places in Moab. Secondly, they are both long oracles. Thirdly, the tone of lament that runs through each of them is striking, if not the most prominent feature of both. These similarities have led commentators to surmise that one author has quarried material from the other, or that both have relied on a common source. At the same time, there are notable differences between these oracles. For instance, Jeremiah 48 explains that Moab's destruction is the Lord's punishment meted out to Moab because of her offenses. The text cites some of these misdeeds. It also communicates Moab's future restoration. In contrast, Isaiah 15 to 16 does not depict Moab's calamity in terms of the Lord's punishment, and appears disinterested in Moab's sins as well as her ultimate reversal of fortunes. The Lord is also conspicuously absent by name until the addendum in Isaiah 15 through 16, whereas Jeremiah 48 frequently refers to him. Moreover, there is no equivalent section in Jeremiah 48 to Isaiah 16, 1 through 5, a passage that is often supposed to be a Moabite appeal to Judah and which looks forward to a righteous Davidic king. As well, Isaiah's oracle concerning Moab concludes with a self-confessed later addendum, which Jeremiah's does not. So there's a lot of interesting things there that I didn't necessarily pick up on the first reading. I had totally missed that the Tetragrammaton, the name of the Lord, does not actually appear anywhere in this main prophecy against Moab. It's not until the very end of chapter 16, in what is clearly an addendum, do we see the actual Tetragrammaton appear. That's very interesting. Also, because it does not appear, it is not clear at all why Moab is being punished in Isaiah. It does not clearly state that this is the Lord's doing, nor are we told much about the nature of the destruction that is happening, and we don't really do much about listing the sins of Moab at all, other than mentioning that Moab was very proud and lifted up. It doesn't actually catalog its real misdeeds, whereas Jeremiah does. In Isaiah, we do get this prophecy of the Davidic king, which I quoted from at the opening of this video. Anyway, that's a great dissertation. If you want to dive into this in depth, I recommend you give it a read. Joseph Blenkinsop, one of the scholars on Isaiah, he observes that there are 23 place names in Isaiah chapters 15 and 16, and 15 of those are also mentioned in Jeremiah 48. And he notes that whilst many of them cannot be identified, it seems that the most densely populated areas of Moab were affected. These place names that we see in Jeremiah and Isaiah are some of the best outlines we have of what the major cities of Moab were. As we go into verse 1, we start off with this remarkable statement. Send the lamb to the ruler of the land, from Selah by way of the desert, to the mount of the daughter of Zion. Well, this word for lamb here is a young ram, one that is intended for ritual slaughter. It is written as singular in the traditional text, although based on the Targum, it might have been intended to be a plural word. But the idea here that someone is sending a lamb or lambs to Zion, to Jerusalem, to offer as a gift or a tribute is interesting. Does this mean Moab is sending it? That's the general interpretation here, is that Moab is sending ritual offerings to the daughter of Zion in Jerusalem. And why is this happening? Well, we go on to verse 2. and it shall be like a bird fleeing, a nest scattered. So the imagery is poignant that the Lord sometimes is pictured as a mother bird that gathers her young to her nest. Here we have the opposite, that these birds are scattered and they are being cast out of the nest. And it says, so are the daughters of Moab at the fords of Arnon. These fords, the word indicates crossing points. The Arnon was a major river that created a steep chasm through the plains. The displaced people are caught at this river crossing, and that's part of the fate of the exiles here, is trying to get across the steep chasm and this river that they must find a way across. This seems to be a repeated story throughout history as we think of the famous crossing of the Jordan with the Israelites and so forth. The idea of escaping danger through a river and leading into a new phase of life by crossing over a river. There's a lot of interesting symbolism that goes on through this. And again, we don't have any historical idea of what this is actually talking about. Unfortunately, our knowledge of the history of the nation of Moab is almost non-existent. And it's surprising to think of an entire nation of people that can disappear without a trace, but we actually have many that have even less trace than Moab, that were major peoples in the ancient world. But we don't know much about what this historically refers to, or if this was something that literally happened where refugees were trying to cross the Arnon and were calling upon Jerusalem for help. Or if this is simply speaking in symbols, with the nation of Moab being a symbol and this type of reaching out to other nations being a symbol for Isaiah's vast sweeping idea of a unified world and world peace, which does seem to be a theme through a lot of these burdens against the nations. We continue with verse 3, and we get this command here: bring counsel, make justice. Now, this word for justice is not the usual word for justice. The usual word is mishpat. This is a different word, which is pelila. And this is the only place where this word shows up. However, there is a rather similar word with an extra letter in it that also shows up in Isaiah over in chapter 28, verse 7, that is pelilia. And so these two rare words might reflect something unique to Isaiah's vocabulary here. The general sense that we have is that it is a legal decision of some kind. The word indicates the kind of decision that would be reached to restore stolen or damaged property. And so the idea here is that somebody here is being commanded to bring counsel to these people and to make them whole, to bring justice to them. And who is being commanded? Let's continue. Make your shade like night at the height of noon. The idea of shade is a very important thing in the desert, and it is seen as protection and is often used as a symbol of protection. These people that are commanded to bring them counsel and justice are also told to give them shade, making their shadow or their shade like night, meaning they have blocked out all the light, even at the height of noon. So it's saying that these people will be getting fried by the sun and the desert noon sun, and they are to provide them shelter and shade in that setting. And then it has a nice little chiasm here. Hide the outcasts. The fugitive do not reveal. So we've got here the idea of these fleeing birds that have been kicked out of the nest, that are at the river crossing, and we are told that we are to bring them counsel and justice, that we are to give them shade, and we are to hide them from whoever is chasing them. The idea that they are to be brought in as refugees and cared for is the very strong theme of this. Now, the word for fugitive here, this is from the same root as the word for fleeing, when we talked about the fleeing birds previously in verse 2. Both the words outcasts and fugitive seem to imply scattered animals and seem to be an extension of the same metaphor of the people of Moab being these scattered birds. And we continue with this word for outcasts here in verse 4. Let the outcasts of Moab sojourn among you. Be a hiding place to them from the destroyer. Now, there's a couple of things to note about the translation here. First is that the traditional vowels that are put with the text in verse 4 would actually read, let dwell among you my outcasts, Moab. But there are a couple of manuscripts, as well as the Septuagint and the Syriac, that support changing these vowels to let it read, let dwell among you the outcasts of Moab. So my outcasts, Moab, changes to outcasts of Moab. And given the context here of Moab fleeing and someone being commanded to take them in, that makes much more sense in context. And so that is undoubtedly the better reading here. And remember, the vowels were added considerably later and are not as ancient as the consonantal text. So it's pretty normal to change the vowels as you read through this. And the fleeing Moabites are hardly in a position to take in any outcast from anyone based on the description here. So it doesn't make sense that they're being asked to take in the outcast. So the thrust of these 4 verses here seems to be that the daughter of Zion is being given these offerings, these lambs, and she is being told to take care of Moab. And so this is a very interesting thing, that Moab has been destroyed. Her outcasts are fleeing there at the fords of the river. And the daughter of Zion is to send them aid. She is to take them in and have them dwell among her. This goes to Isaiah's recurring theme that his religion was not just for the Israelites or the Judahites, but it was intended to be a worldwide religion, that all nations would flow to the mountain of the Lord. And this seems to be part of that, that in their destruction and distress, Moab would turn to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem should welcome that and bring them in. Now, the relationship between Moab and Judah is a very interesting one. We get a few senses of it throughout the entire Hebrew Bible, starting with its supposed origin story in Genesis, which is this ignominious story of Lot and his daughters, which is clearly mocking Moab and even making fun of their name, suggesting that it implies incest. But then we also have other stories like the book of Ruth, where it tells us that Moabites were actually a major part of the Davidic line through Ruth, and that Ruth was an example of an ideal woman who was actually a Moabite, not an Israelite. And so there's an interesting back and forth there. Moab was never a good friend to Israel. They were often a thorn in their side, but there was also this sort of kinship with them and a complete acceptance that they could be brought into the Israelite culture and even play a portion in the royal family. And so it is this complex relationship with Moab here. But here we are being told that as they flee, Jerusalem is to reach out to them and let them sojourn among them. Now, as we talk about the Hebrew Bible, it's always important to understand how this text impacted history. And these sections here, Isaiah 16 verses 3 and 4, they are this obscure prophecy about ancient Moab, but they wound up appearing in 19th century writings about slavery in the United States, particularly in context of the opposition to fugitive slave laws. These verses were linked with other biblical passages to create a network of proof texts used to justify assisting persons who had escaped slavery in the South. Eventually, the line "hide the outcast" from verse 3 took on a life of its own as an abolitionist slogan. So here is this 3,000-year-old text that is still finding relevance in 19th century US politics and on important subjects of human rights and slavery. So, of course, there were rebuttals to this usage of the text, mostly by anti-abolitionist writers, which those began to appear in the 1850s, and they criticized the decontextualization of the verses. Although I don't find that a very convincing argument, in context, these verses do seem to support the idea of hiding fugitive slaves. It seems to be a very close parallel to what Israel is commanded to do. But of course, the anti-abolitionists conjured up all sorts of ideas about interracial intimacy and so forth. But this text continued to be a powerful symbol and rallying point throughout the 1850s and 1860s in response to the Fugitive Slave Act and also the execution of John Brown. The scripture was invoked there as well. There is a good article about this in the Harvard Theological Review that I will post a link to in the comments. But moving back to the 8th century BCE, we're told to hide them, and then we're told that the oppressor be no more, destruction finished, the trampler ended from the land. This word oppressor, it appears nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible, and its meaning is just a bit of a guess from context. It is actually spelled differently in the Dead Sea Scrolls. If that spelling in the Dead Sea Scrolls is the correct one, then it does match a word that is only used once, and that was also by Isaiah back in chapter 1, verse 17. So if the Dead Sea Scrolls spelling is correct, this word shows up twice, and it's exclusive to Isaiah again. So another unique Isaiah word. And then we have the remarkable prophecy in 5 here about a future Davidic king. As we are talking about them sending the petition to the daughter of Zion, and the daughter of Zion being told to take care of them and bring them in, and to allow them to be relieved from the oppression and the destruction and the trampler, the boots trampling through their land. It invokes sort of the idea of an army. We then come to this verse 5, which says, and in steadfast love a throne will be established, and he will sit upon it in truth. Now, this word for steadfast love is the Hebrew word chesed. Now, I've argued before that this word is often underrated as to its importance. It is often translated as mercy or loving kindness. Notably in Psalm 136, there's a recurring refrain, his mercy endures forever, his chesed endures forever. But it's more than that. It implies a covenant relationship, often between a lord and a vassal, between a father and a child, between a husband and a wife. And so there is the idea here that it isn't just love, but it is love with obligations, and particularly the obligations of the higher in the relationship to care for and protect the lower. And so invoking the word chesed here after we're being told to care for the fleeing refugees seems to be of this same sense, that in chesed a throne will be established. So there will be a king in Zion that will be a kind and welcoming king to these people, and he will sit upon it in truth. We don't have any antecedent to the pronoun he. We just have to assume this is referring to a king because, well, he's sitting on a throne. So we have a throne being established, and we have a person sitting upon it in truth. So this is clearly a righteous king. And then the verse continues to define this king a little bit more, in the tent of David. So now we know this is a Davidic king that is going to be on this throne. Judge and seeker of justice and swift righteousness. The Hebrew's a little choppy here, but it seems to be a couple of titles that are defining him as his role as judge and seeker of justice, that he is going to be involved in bringing justice back to the land. The obvious choice for who this would be, of course, Hezekiah. Isaiah had a great respect and love for Hezekiah, and he seems to be one of the ones that he really prophesied as the one who's going to be a major turnaround for the children of Israel. And we're going to see a few chapters down the road that Hezekiah is going to be quite the heroic figure as Assyria comes marching up to their gates. But this may also be part of the beginnings of the messianic idea that Isaiah also delves into, of some type of a future righteous Davidic king. Again, we don't know if this is intended to be a historical event that happened in or near the time of Isaiah, or if this is speaking in symbols and not really tied to historical events at all. It's not clear at all which we're actually dealing with here. I will note that justice and righteousness are two of Isaiah's favorite words that he constantly uses for an ideal society. Now we have a major shift in theme as we go into verse 6 here, that we leave the plea to be kind to the refugees and learn a bit more about the scene of destruction that they faced. This sudden shift towards destruction and this change from empathy and compassion to the horrors of war is striking in both chapters 15 and 16. We make these wild swings here. We have verse 6 saying, we have heard the pride of Moab, very proud, his pride, and his bursting anger does not make true his boasting. Now, I kept the translation pretty close to the Hebrew. A lot of translations won't be that close to the Hebrew because it's a little odd in English. But this verse here has 4 different forms of the same word for pride. And each one is slightly different, but I wanted to keep it in there that we have the pride of Moab, very proud, his pride and his pride. And that last bit there, his pride and his pride, they use a masculine and a feminine form of the same word to just make some difference. And Isaiah does this a couple of places, but this is one where he reuses the word in both its masculine and its feminine form for emphasis, for poetry. Hard to say what his purpose was there, but it's part of how Isaiah likes to construct his verses. So he uses this same word 4 different ways in that little bit of line there. Very interesting use of language. And then it ends with a little bit of an odd thing on the end here. These last 2 lines, it feels like there's a word missing. And different translators have come up with a few different ways to construct this last 2 lines because it's not quite clear what it's saying. It has his bursting anger. The word here that's used for bursting anger is actually the same root as the word that was translated as fords before, a crossing point. This is anger that pushes you past your boundaries. And so bursting anger seems like a good way to describe that. So he has his anger here, and then we have the words not true, and then his boasting. And it feels like there's a word missing there. So the only way to try and put that together is to come up with something like his anger doesn't make his boasting true, but it is a bit choppy and a little bit hard to comprehend what the smooth way to say that would be in English or what exactly was intended. So translators tend to have a lot of variance on that line. Coming to verse 7, let Moab wail for Moab. Let everyone wail. And so the idea here is that there is mourning. There is mourning throughout the country. This is a tragedy. And why is it a tragedy? Let's describe the destruction here. For the raisin cakes of Kir Hareseth mourn, utterly stricken, for the fields of Heshbon wither, and the vine of Shibma, and the lords of the nations have struck down her fine grapes. So we're going through the different parts of Moab here, listing city-states, and we're talking particularly about their agriculture here. We start with the idea of these raisin cakes, which is an interesting thing. Some people think that these might have had a cultic significance, but it doesn't seem so in context here. It mentions the vineyards and the grapes for the fine wine and so forth. So raisin cakes would just be yet a different use of grapes. It probably is not intended to be so much a cultic thing as just another fine agricultural product that was produced by Moab. And it's particularly talking about their production of grapes. And so these are all the different areas where the grapes used to grow that are now lost. And this was probably thought of as Moab's main source of wealth that has been destroyed here. And it mentions that the lords of the nations have struck down her fine grapes. Well, who are the lords of the nations? This is the Baalei of the Goyim. It's not at all clear who they are. And again, there's not a way to link this to a historical event, but it sounds like there are multiple nations involved. Not just that this was an invasion from Assyria, but that maybe multiple nations came in and destroyed the Moabites. But unfortunately, most of the history of the Moabites is simply lost to time. Now, this word for fine grapes, the word is sharok, and it is the same word that we had back in chapter 5 when we sung of the Lord's vineyard, that he planted fine grapes there. The same word was there. It is a valued bright red species of grape. And we don't know a whole lot more of it than that. It's not a very common word, but this was the finest of grapes, apparently, and it was what the Lord planted in his own vineyard. And so now we're making connections back to other parts of Isaiah's writing where the Lord talked about that Judah was his vineyard. And so here is this other vineyard here of Moab, and they have fine grapes too that have been destroyed, much as what happens in Isaiah chapter 5. And so the parallels there seem significant. Now, this next part seems to be describing the grapevines themselves. Onto Yazer they touched, and wandered the deserts, her shoots spreading out, they crossed the sea. Now, not every translator agrees that this is talking about the vines. Some think this might be referring to the lords of the nations that are destroying the vines. But no, it seems to me a pretty strong argument that this is talking about that the vines, the grapevines, were everywhere, that they spread out across the desert, an area where you don't normally get to grow grapes, and they went all the way across the sea. Now, it's not clear what sea they mean. Maybe it was the Dead Sea, and that would be across the sea into Judah. And so maybe that's what they're talking about there. But the idea seems to be to illustrate just how much is lost with Moab's fall. But that they had these vines that spread out everywhere, producing these beautiful grapes that have all now been cut down by whoever these lords of the nations are. And then 9 comes another significant verse here. Therefore I weep with the weeping of Yazer, for the vine of Shibma. I drench you with my tears, O Heshbon and Elealeh. The word here for tears is a play on words. It is a similar word to the word for pressed wine, which is continuing this great metaphor. And so by saying, I drench you with my tears, he is doing a play on word of, I drench you with pressed wine, newly pressed wine. And so we are still talking about this idea of the grapevine. And we have here the idea of someone is weeping, and he's drenching them with their tears and naming these other Moabite cities. Who is it that's weeping? It appears to be that this is the Lord himself that is weeping, and that he weeps over the loss for Moab. And so this whole chapter seems to be much more generous towards Moab than the last chapter. We mentioned the weeping in the last chapter, but here it does really strike me as hard to not see these verses as sincere, that we're discussing their tragic state as scattered birds on the ford of a river in need of saving, and a commandment to go save them. And the idea that although they were proud and asked for what they got, there is weeping over their loss and the great loss of their magnificent country. And it concludes here, for over your summer fruit and your harvest, the shout has fallen. There's a sound play on these words in Hebrew here, ketze and ketzire. And so the idea is the harvest time is normally a place where there is shouting, particularly joyful shouting, singing and celebration. This word here for shout can be a cry of triumph or joy, and the reference here is to the joy of harvest. The same word is going to be used again in the next verse. The word only shows up 5 times, and only in Isaiah and Jeremiah, which is in verse 48, which seems to be pulling from this chapter. So this is another interesting Isaiah word that Jeremiah borrows when he is also borrowing material from this chapter. So this word for shouting is a bit unique to Isaiah. And we continue with the next verse. And joy and gladness are taken away from the fruitful field, and in the vineyards, no song, no cheer. Wine in the presses, no treader treads out. The shouting I end. Very nice. You can understand this as 2 chiasms right next to each other. The idea here is that there is no more joy and gladness, and there's nobody treading out the grapes. This would normally be a joyous time where people stomp on the grapes and we produce the great wine, which will be part of what will cause wealth to flow into the nation. But none of that is happening this time because they have all been driven out and are now like scattered birds. The shouting, the joyful shouting, the Lord has ended. And again, we have the mourning from the Lord himself. Therefore, my inner parts moan like a lyre for Moab, and my inmost self for Kir Hareseth. This may be the end of the poem, this last final line here. The word for inner parts and inmost self, not really thrilled with those translations, but the idea is his insides, his very heart, his guts. I wanted to use guts, but guts doesn't sound right in a Bible translation. But yes, his guts strum like a lyre for Moab. And strum sounds more like what you do with a lyre too. I don't like moan, but the idea of a lyre or a harp, which is an instrument that was used quite a lot in the ancient world. We have some that have been found archaeologically, that this is playing a sad tune to commemorate the loss of Moab. And so his very guts are twisted up and playing a tune for the poor people of Moab who have lost everything. His inner being, his inside parts are hurting for these towns that used to produce these great raisin cakes. Now, verse 12 here, it's not clear, nobody's quite certain if this goes with the poem that just preceded it as a final conclusion to it, or if it belongs with what follows. But it appears that the poem ends here, and then we have what is clearly an addendum after it. And so, what do you think? Do you think this is part of the addendum, or do you think this is a final conclusion to that poem? Let me know in the comments. And it shall be, when Moab presents himself, and he wearies himself on the high place, when he comes to his sanctuary to pray, he will not be able. Part of the reason why this doesn't look like it belongs to the above is it seems to have left some of the poetic form that was previously throughout the prophecy. This seems to be a bit more prose, a bit wordier than what we had above, and seems to be more of an explanation. And so the idea here is that when Moab goes to his sacred places, his high place, and perhaps his temple here, where it says his sanctuary, and offers his prayer, he will not be able. It's not quite clear what is stopping him, or if maybe just he will be ineffective in doing so, but he will go perhaps turning to his own god Chemosh and not be able to get any kind of response or relief from that. But perhaps they will not have the strength to perform whatever ritual or prayer is required of them. Now, these next two verses are clearly an addition, and it's a little bit uncertain if they were the words of Isaiah or a later author, but apparently somebody must have been somewhat concerned that the prophecy was outdated and needed this type of an addition. And perhaps it was maybe added in the time of Jeremiah and reflects the prophecies of that time. Was this ever fulfilled? It's hard to say. It seems that the Moabites survived the Assyrians by paying them tribute, but the Babylonians in the time of Jeremiah would conquer them, and that's where they kind of disappear from history. Looking at the Encyclopedia Britannica, they describe it this way: Moab had become a tributary of Assyria by late 8th century BCE and was conquered by the Babylonians in 582 BCE, upon which the Moabites disappeared from history. Their territory was resettled by the Nabateans in the 4th to 3rd century BCE. So they just kind of disappear, and we don't know why. But they would disappear quite a bit after Isaiah's time, maybe 100, 150 years after Isaiah's time, that they would finally disappear. But perhaps somebody was concerned that this prophecy hadn't come true yet. And we have this verses 13 and 14. This is the word that the Lord spoke concerning Moab in the past. So we already have here 13 explaining what you've just read is what we had prophesied previously. And that might include verse 12 here, that Moab would try to go to their temples and would not be able to invoke the power of their God to save them. That would fit nicely with 13 as part of that. Verse 14 here then says, "Now the Lord has spoken, saying, in 3 years, like the years of a hired worker, the glory of Moab will be brought into contempt with all the great multitude, and a precious few will remain, not mighty." So it seems to be saying here, and note that 13 and 14 is the first time we actually invoke the tetragrammaton here. The rest have not had it. This is where it first shows up, and explains that this was the prophecy that the Lord had given previously, but now we're saying it's really going to happen now. It's going to be 3 years, and this is going to happen. But when was this last verse added? Was it added in the time of Isaiah? Was it added in the time of Jeremiah? It's impossible to say. But they added here that 3 years, and it gives us an interesting thing here, like the years of a hired worker. And Isaiah actually uses this reference a couple of times. one might infer that there are contractual arrangements in all likelihood for indentured servants, and that a fixed period of service was commonly 3 years, and so that's why he uses it. But just as a hired worker awaits the end of his period of service and then recompense and liberation come in the end, the Israelites are promised that destruction of Moab's coming real soon now. Now, this other phrase here, precious few, this is a phrase that again is unique to Isaiah, and he uses it 4 times. It's kind of a fun little phrase that he has. And yeah, it's just only Isaiah uses this phrase, and he uses it several times. So there is a sort of a unique Isaiah vocabulary that is expressed in this. And it's part of what causes me and many others to see the unity of the book of Isaiah, whereas many people would like to pick it apart and see how many authors they can see in the text. There is a certain unity to the style and the flair that is used throughout that is somewhat pervasive throughout the entire book. Anyway, that's all we've got in chapter 16. And if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.